My presentation today is about forest industry health check and the impacts from the past on the current state, and then some thoughts about the future going forward. So these are just definitions that I found on the internet of forest industry, and a lot of times I think most people think of forest industry as the wood products, and that certainly is a component of the forest industry, but I think there's more to the forest industry than just lumber, just plywood. It's an aggregate of establishments. So to me, that's the landowner, that's the logger, that's the log truck driver, that's the mill, but that's also regulatory agencies, that's also the IRS and so forth. So there's a variety of players in the forest industry. It's also legislators as well. And then even think, like the Park Service, and so I think can also be considered in the forest industry. So you have wildlife habitat, so hunting leases, clean water, biodiversity, and then recreation. So things like hiking and interpretation as well. Here's another one. Industry concerns itself with the development, cultivation, management, and preservation of forests. So both preservation and conservation, lumber, wood for sure, but sinks for carbon dioxide as well. So carbon sequestration and carbon markets, wildlife, human recreation. Here's another one. Multiple use management. So when we're talking about any more with multiple use management in the forest industry beyond just whack 'em and stack 'em timber, water quality, wildlife habitat, recreation, and even wilderness. So here's your moose, here's your wildlife habitat, your water quality, water yield, here's your recreation, and even beyond that, your heirs, passing down forest property. So family forest and family ownership and how they may differ, say, from industry or industrial or public land ownership. Here's a position statement from the Society of American Foresters on the forest products, industries, and markets, and actions that enhance the productivity and competitiveness of forest products. So maybe what many of us think is the forest industry, and the importance of forest products to the rural economies, but now also the urban economies as well. Say recreation, I know hiking leases and dog walking leases and hunting leases are important now, but even the Wildland Urban Interface and how wildfire issues are creating issues there, and the forest kind of creeping into more of a residential suburbia urban setting, various industries and economic incentive for the sustainable management. Sustainability is becoming a bigger issue as we're going forward, and sustainably sourced wood and fiber, and regulations that are playing on the forest industry. So here's the wood supply chain, and I was trying to find a good diagram, and to me this is a pretty good diagram. So you have the carbon dioxide, and of course light and moisture and photosynthesis and the production of forest, mainly the trees, but we think of the trees, but also undisturbed vegetation, wildlife habitat in there, but water yield, water quality, fisheries as well, timber sales, and the revenue generated from our forest, the forest products from our forest. Then you have the loggers and their impact of felling the trees and allowing the landowner to receive some revenue, as well as conduct forest management for not just timber, but also for wildlife habitat or water yield, right? We have other types of thinnings and clear cuts sometimes for water quality, water yield, and how following the logging you have reforestation, which then goes back to the forest land, and then you have the transportation, the log trucking component there. And then ultimately, this goes to saw log, pulpwood, and biomass kind of wood products. Of course, there's a few more as well, but nonetheless, these are kind of encompassing. And the saw logs to the lumbers, timbers, plywood, and then mass timber as well. But the byproducts, the sawmill residuals and mass timber residuals and plywood residuals, and then the secondary manufacturing for like trusses and so forth that come from the initial lumber, let's say. But the importance of the byproducts, and I'll come back to that here in a second. And then the pulpwood, your oriented strand board, and the secondary manufacturing, for homes, for trusses, let's say, packaging, paper, and pulp, and then wood pellets going for energy. And then, of course, these then go to byproducts and secondary manufacturing as well. And then you have your biomass, coming from the transportation to the biomass for wood pellets, and then energy here as well. And then if we go back to the byproducts, and this is becoming very important, clean chips, I guess you could say, but right, shavings, and the importance of that for the paper industry, say issues with round wood, paper mills and pulp mills, rather using residuals instead of round wood, but also for wood pellets and then for energy and the byproducts. The importance of that as we go forward, and as we get more and more saw mills, and what's going to happen to our round wood here in the southeast, at least our round wood harvest, and more sawmills that are going to give more and more residuals that are going to make it more competitive with the round wood pulpwood. So I think this is a very good schematic. And then the reforestation leading back to the forest land, and then to the oxygen that of course we all think of with trees. So you have your forest landowners, and then your loggers, and then your mills and your markets, kind of your three-legged stool. And you take one of these out, I think you really hurt the wood supply chain, and you really basically nullify the two other. So definitely the three of them need to work together. And so there's not just these three, but then there's also regulatory agencies, certification, policy, and societal demands. Kind of going back to this here, what is the societal demand for these products and the importance of that? But the regulatory agencies, including, say, the IRS and the Department of Revenue, the forced taxation, property taxes, income taxes, right, that are very important, certification, SFI, FSC, and tree farm, and I know Canada has some as well. Policy, like the EPA, and regulatory issues related to the use of herbicides, as well as water quality, I know, and even things like the Corps of Engineers and flooding issues and so forth. And then the European Union regulatory agencies, as well as policy. What are their policies related to the forest where this wood is coming from for their wood pellets, say, going to Europe from the southeast, or maybe other parts of the country, but at least the southeast. Then you have like your cost shares as well, USDA, NRCS, and FSA, and there's others as well, the state agencies that are coming into play. And then your societal demands, as I said, what are they demanding? Meaning the forest, you can grow the greatest trees in the world, but if there's no demand for that wood, right, you have very limited market, so you can't really sell that wood. So you also have to have that societal demand with that three-legged stool of the landowner, logger, and mill, but you also have to have demand for those products. But the importance of policy, so here we're talking about these reforestation incentive programs, and I'm going to come back to this throughout this presentation today, but this is the soil bank here that created a lot of plantations. This is planted annually, acres planted, a lot of it pine, a lot of it the southeast, but also hardwoods as well, and then of course other parts of the country. I know the lake states, this program was pretty big here back in the 50s for many of the plantations, red pine plantations. But here we can see this today, everybody, in 1985, the CRP, and again in 2000, and how this impacts our timber supply. And that's good that we have that timber supply, but the impact of this to smaller landowners, and the impact of this to our timber supply, and say, like when the lumber prices, what's it doing to the relationship between the lumber prices and the sawlog stumpage price? And so I'll come back to this, but just this policy that comes about that can create, that can greatly impact the wood supply chain, the landowners, logger, and mill, ultimately. So let's talk about landowners. So you have private and public, and private NIPF and family forest owners. Sometimes I don't know if I fully understand the difference between those two, but they're kind of, I think one is a subset of the other. Forest industry and TIMOs and REITs, timber investment management organizations, and real estate investment trust, and I'll talk a little bit about that here, how more important, a bigger player they become, trust in general. And then your public, right, your Forest Service, Bureau of Land Management, tribal, counties, and municipal. And the difference is regionally across the country, the South, much more private NIPF and family forest with a fair amount of industry. And you can see that here, everybody, in the South, a lot of private here. And then the West, much more federal, a fair amount of state, but much more federal here in the West, and some amount of state. Some of those states have pretty good state lands, amount of state land. And in the lake states, heavy counties. I'm not saying it's predominant counties, but what I'm saying is they had a lot of the counties had pretty good acreages there. And the state lands here as well in these in the lake states, and then some federal, and then NIPF. But the South, much more industry and NIPF, and in the West, federal, and then the lake states, fairly heavy, kind of more local state and county. And then the Northeast too, right, is a lot more NIPF, I believe, as well. So, and how this comes into play, even with things like the USDA FIA, Forest Inventory and Analysis, trying to come up with a standard protocol, like in the beginning in the 2000, and these panels and these cycles, or forest carbon markets, trying to come up with a market that can be used for all the different forest types, and the management regimes and the harvesting practices that go on, and the rotations and the growth rates can be difficult, and we're seeing that, say, with the forest carbon markets. Now let's switch a little bit to the federal, and the Bureau of Land Management, tribals, other examples, but let's say the Forest Service, and their great reduction in harvesting across the country, even in the southeast U.S. And what impact is this having on those rural economies? This part of this money would go to funding counties and school districts, I believe. Particularly, think of that out west, where you are heavily federally dominated. Do those states want those federal lands going forward? And I've already seen some issues. Some of you may remember, like in Utah. Do they want that, given the loss in revenue? Maybe the states want those for us. Then, how is this playing with wildfire? The great increase in the cost of wildfire suppression. Is that management creating issues with wildfires? And that's something that we're not going to go deep into here, but right, the loss of revenue from timber harvest, as well as perhaps the increased cost of fire suppression, and the budgets of the Forest Service, for example, how the percent of the annual budgets going to fight the wildfires is increasing. Will that increase? What's going to be in the future? And the impacts to the rural economies, but even the Wildland Urban Interface, the WUI. So let's talk a little bit about industry. And what I've seen from my time, I first got into forestry around 93, graduated in 96 from Stephen F. Austin, and I think I kind of caught the tail end of the fully integrated timber companies, where the companies own the land and the mill, and the forest land was geared much for the mill. Everything was about I think things were much more about productivity, less so about maximizing financial returns, because everything was supplying the wood, the right amount of wood, in the right time to the mill. The mill was the money maker, and the forest land was kind of secondary. Then, beginning around mid-90s, maybe late 90s, early 2000s, you had a shift to TIMOs and REITs, where these integrated timber companies, a lot of them divested their lands off because, I think, advantageous tax structures, into split companies, or sold their lands. And they didn't have to carry those forest lands, the property tax and the maintenance of those forest lands, and they could just get their timber for the mills from other landowners or through contracts with the TIMOs or REITs. And so before that, when fully integrated, most of the company land, I believe, provided much of the timber for the mill with some gatewood. Now I think it's a lot more open market and competitive, and that's good in some ways for the TIMOs and REITs, and that's going to create some issues here when I talk about the WUI coming up. But it's a different environment, and a lot of these integrated companies had a fair amount of investment and research in their own companies, and then you had all these research cooperatives, and you still have some of these, but I've certainly seen a decrease in my experience with investment in company specific research components, and even some of the research cooperatives. So, and by the way, I've been involved with a lot of industrial and state and federal research cooperatives across the country. So I'm certainly aware of the situation. So let's talk about family forest landowners, NIPF, non-industrial private forest landowners. And I think there's still a fair amount of acreage in larger land holdings, but certainly with time, these land holdings, the sizes, the acreages are getting smaller. But notice there's a large number of ownerships of smaller acreages, 1 to 9, less than 20 acres. And when we're talking about things like these incentive programs to reforest, and related to that, the fact that these loggers are investing a large amount of capital into these highly productive logging crews, fellow bunchers, skidders, and knuckle boom loaders and processors, and maybe even cut to length, like in the lake states in the west, the tethered, maybe even a little bit in the southeast. But large investment, well, they can't afford really to harvest these smaller landowner holdings, because they got to, in order to maintain or pay for all of that equipment, they got to be productive, economy of scale. So that's going to create an issue as we're going forward, particularly when we get these incentive programs. Beyond that, when we're talking about more parcelization and fragmentation, that's going to create problems for these smaller landowners going forward. Lack of interest by heirs. I see that a lot in Mississippi, where heirs being passed down. Maybe you had a 1,000-acre tract 60 years ago and it was split between 3 children. Now it's being split between 5 children. So is that, or I should say, now it's being split, so it's 333 acres, and then that 333 is being split between 5 children. So now it's like 66 acres, right? I think. Okay, of that original, of the 1,000 was split 333, and then the next generation, and so we're going to probably get more and more smaller acreages. And a lot of these heirs, they're not really concerned, or they don't understand or care about the forest land. So you may have more absentee landowners. And how is that going to impact our timber supply, our forest management? And timber theft may go up, right? A lot more landowners, absentee landowners. And the age of our forest land owners, NIPF, family forest, right, is continuing to increase. A lot of the ownerships and the acreages are, right? So these certainly going to have some passing of property going forward in the next 20 years. What's that going to do? How's all that property going to get split, and how's that going to impact the loggers and the mills? Wildland Urban Interface, this is 2000 and this is 2010. Roughly, I think you can compare these. Think about 2020, 2025 going forward, a lot more red. And Houston, and here's, let's see, this is Houston, this is Dallas here. This might be like Tyler and Shreveport right there, I think, right? But Houston and Atlanta, especially Birmingham a little bit, Charlotte too, but Atlanta and Houston, the WUI, the Wildland Urban Interface, and these forests right on the edge of the urban expansion, the suburban expansion, they're worth a lot more on the real estate market than the timber can produce. Plus you got property taxes you got to pay, so they're going to sell that off, and that's going to create, right, we're going to lose forest land, and then beyond that, you're probably going to have more and more WUI, Seattle too, and I think Los Angeles and places like that, maybe Sacramento. A lot more WUI going forward, and other places as well. I'm not sure about Denver, perhaps, but, right, and what's going to happen going forward, particularly as we get more and more smaller acreages with the WUI, and then with the Forest Service budget, and so we're going to run into more and more issues. Right, people building $1 million homes, $500,000 homes right in the middle of fire-dependent forest, and then wondering why they have issues with wildfires coming through. So that's going to be a problem. But the importance of prescribed burning. So in my opinion, the South has kind of had a culture. Smokey the Bear is not all bad, but there are some things about Smokey the Bear that may have been a little misunderstood. And the South, I think, has continued to have a culture of fire coming down from the Native Americans. But whereas a lot of the West, and maybe even the lake states, the West doesn't have that culture that we've had. So now you've got some very serious issues with wildfires and massive wildfires. In my opinion, a lot of the forests here are probably not natural forests because we've created non-natural forests with fire suppression, and we've allowed for ladder fuels and things. And so prescribed burning going forward is going to probably become very important, but this is going to be an interesting situation. The importance of plantations here in the southeast United States, particularly loblolly pine, and this is, I think, pretty important on the west side of the Cascades as well. The lake states have some, but not to the degree that the southeast and the west side do of the Cascades, and Douglas fir particularly. So we do have some natural stands, but certainly the importance of loblolly pine plantations to much of the economies here in the southeast United States. But look at the stumpage values. So remember those incentives that are coming down from the CRP. Flat line, pine saw timber, probably supply. But the pulpwood market in Mississippi, I'm just going to talk about Mississippi, is just honestly is horrible or atrocious. Many landowners cannot even conduct first thinnings, and they were coming off of these CRP plantings and the densities that they I believe had to plant in order to get the funding. So we've created a lot of issues with supply, oversupply, not enough demand in many parts of the Southeast. I don't think in Georgia, and I'll show you that here in a minute, I don't think Georgia, South Carolina, Florida necessarily have these problems, but I see this a lot in many parts of the western half of the southeastern U.S. And basically the flat line to where, like in the Pacific Northwest, I think the landowner and the logger saw some of the great jump in the lumber prices, but we didn't see that here in the Southeast because we probably had an abundance of supply. And so it really was not as well correlated as we would have liked. But I'll come back to that in a little bit. But the ability in the Southeast, at least, and I think on the west side, Douglas fir, I think the plant rotations coming down from 60 years plantations down to probably, I see a lot now, 40-year rotations. Just the genetic improvement, weed control here in the South beginning in the mid-70s, but certainly in the late 70s and 80s. Alston, Escort, I believe, and Velpar, and then in the nurseries as well. Better seedlings going forward, oxyfluorophene and lactofen cobra, and our better quality seedlings, larger diameter seedlings. Site preparation and fertilization got a lot better, much more chemical site prep, not as much as mechanical. Better idea of how to plant, but our productivity has greatly increased because of this. Rotation ages have gone down, but we're maybe going to create a problem because, right, on a per acre basis, we're creating more productivity. And so, remember the mill demand, so we have to have the mills to have that demand. And then going forward, everybody, what's going to be the mass control pollinated, better quality seedlings, which are good, but what's the cost involved here? So I think we're going to see a trend in lower planting densities going forward, at least for some time. Pulpwood markets in much of the western half, at least, are not that good, are pretty bad. So trying to get away from a two thinning regime more to a single thinning regime by planting lower seedlings, much like the Pacific Northwest has for probably for 60 years, planting around 400 to 500 seedlings per acre, just going for a single thinning, but really I'd say predominantly, from what I've seen at least, just the final clear cut. And you're not going to thinnings. But think about the cost of harvesting for a pulpwood thinning out west in those mountainous regions. But I think we'll start seeing that here too, to where, and then as we get more and more sawmills here, and the residuals coming off of those sawmills, and those clean chips or clean wood competing with our round wood, pulpwood. So we're going to create a situation where there's not going to be a strong demand for the roundwood pulpwood. And so I think we're going to see a switch kind of into planting densities going forward, given how I see the market conditions going. And then we have forest health. So luckily we haven't had too many issues with southern pine beetle lately, but the correlation, at least in Mississippi and I think parts of Alabama, so with the national forest and with federal land, a lot of these forests, I believe, are older. They haven't probably been actively thinned. And so you're going to see issues there going forward. So those landowners near those national forests may have issues because of the national forest. And let me come back to this when I talk about IPs. But and then invasive plants like Kogan grass and kudzu, right? We all know that's probably going to get a little bit bigger issue going forward. Emerald ash borer, for example, along with southern pine beetle and IPs. There's certainly other insects as well. Chronic wasting disease and its importance to, I know like in Mississippi, importance of the hunting leases and the hunting revenue for the rural areas around Memphis in North Mississippi. Wild boars, wild pigs, boars, and the problems that they're creating. And so these things are going forward here with the forest health. And then the mountain pine beetle and wildfires and the regulatory issues, but the mountain pine beetle out west and how that's leading, I think, to a lot of timber companies, mills moving south from Canada, especially, but even the Northwest and the Lake States, because of the growth rates that we have here, maybe the tax structures that we have here, the regulatory issues, a lot more friendly, maybe perhaps in many ways. But that issue there that's being created, British Columbia was a huge producer of lumber, of timber. So how that's moving south. And here's the drought that we had in Mississippi and Louisiana. I mean, just southwest Mississippi has been devastated. But southern pine beetle was not much of an issue. Ips just tore up southwest Mississippi. I mean, you see just literally a lot of dead trees driving down highways or going into properties, and seeing destruction by ips beyond what we normally see. So rather than let's like 5 or 6 trees in a pocket, maybe 50, 60 trees due to ips. And so that drought was really severe, and I know it went into Louisiana as well. So ips really was the problem in Mississippi, not so much southern pine beetle. Mineral rights, right? Surface rights versus the mineral below surface rights, going to be an issue going forward. And parcelization and fragmentation as we get more and more parcelization. So let's say this property gets split up into 2, 1 landowner or 2 landowner, and now you got a 3rd player here. So now the mineral companies now got to deal with 2 different landowners, and how that's going to play out going forward. I think parcelization and fragmentation are going to be an issue with mineral rights and passing down of heirs, and how that's going to go in the future with making sure everybody's okay with what's going on with the mineral rights. Hunting leases, that's a big source of revenue for absentee landowners, I know, and industry as well. I know in the West, I believe, over the last 30 years, maybe I'm wrong, but they have now started to come to hunting leases like the Southeast had for years. And I think even in the lake states, hunting leases on industrial land is much more popular than it used to be. More pay as cut timber sales rather than lump sum. That's good or bad, but making sure that landowner is working with a forester to ensure that every load and every ton coming off of there is paid for by the logger or by the mill. And so that's going to be an issue. There are advantages and disadvantages to lump sum versus sealed bid that I'm not going to go into here, but if you want to, we can talk about it. And then property taxes, keeping the forest in forest going forward, and property taxes, and like I said, with the WUI and the value of those properties near those bigger cities relative to the property taxes and the value that can be obtained from forestry, is it really worth it given all the costs? And you may just sell to real estate. And so I think here, just our ability, everybody, to inventory remotely, to depict visually these forests, and our ability to communicate different forest management strategies with non-forestry people, legislators and landowners who are not foresters. Our ability, lasers, and our ability to inventory is becoming better. And then our growth and yield models continue to improve. So we are going in a good direction there. So let's switch to loggers and the essentialness or the importance of logging to forestry. And without loggers, how limited silviculture and forest management becomes. And maybe it just becomes a carbon storage, carbon sequestration market, or basically just justification for forest management thinning, let's say, or management to reduce wildfire hazard or risk. So without loggers in the mills, remember that 3-legged stool, you need those loggers so that the forest landowners and the foresters can practice forestry. So probably beginning in earnest in the 80s up to the 90s, logging operations became much more heavily mechanized, meaning every person's encased in a piece of equipment. So the chainsaws, kind of gone away, at least here in the Southeast, right? Harvesting, felling trees with chainsaws and then bucking them up with chainsaws. Now we got these fellow bunchers and skidders and processors in many cases, and the cost of those processors. Still, we got a lot of knuckle boom loaders with pull-through delimbers, right? But much more mechanized. And of course, with that comes much more productivity, much greater productivity, let's say, per unit. So I think we're getting fewer logging firms, right? But in many ways, those particular firms are much more productive. So we're kind of centralizing those logging operations. And is that good for competition or so forth? But with that productivity comes a much greater investment, capital investment, and a much greater need to be productive. Therefore, those smaller acreage landowners having problems getting loggers to come out. And we're seeing that already, everybody. And probably, once again, I would say it used to be 40 acres we used to kind of throw around. Now you probably need to have 60 acres or more. And you need to probably have more of a clear cut, right? Not so much a first thinning. Pulpwood thinning is, it's very hard to get a pulpwood thinning, in Mississippi at least. I don't know about so much in Georgia and South Carolina, Florida, where the pulpwood markets are better, but in Mississippi, it's very difficult to get a first thinning, pulpwood dominated first thinning. So once again, we're maybe going to change the planting densities, change our focus, get away from a two thinning regime, go much more to a single thinning regime, or just even a clear cut. Cut to length operations, are they going to become more popular here? Lake states and out west with the tethered are very popular. Tract further bunches may become more popular. I've seen them on some of the wetter sites, like in Louisiana, I know, so that's good. So they may become more popular depending on how our forest management goes. But those downtimes are extremely costly due to these highly mechanized, high investment operations. So productivity, much more productivity, but high investment in this equipment. So that's coming at a cost, and once again, the need to be productive, economy of scale. You got to be harvesting 100-acre tracts all the time, and you got to be productive all the time. Those down times, very costly, and much more consolidation to fewer logging businesses. In woods chipping operations, I see this come and go, where the whole goal is you're felling the trees and harvesting them and skidding them for chipping. The whole tree is chipped, and then that's sent to like a paper mill or maybe a biomass or biofuel facility. So not just a log and slash like we've kind of seen a lot traditionally of a pulpwood harvest or chip and saw log harvest, and the upper slash is chipped, but the whole tree is chipped. As I said, that kind of comes and goes from what I've seen. And then the economies of scale are going to become extremely important. I've already mentioned this. So many landowners in the western part of the southeast, at least, are finding it difficult to conduct pulpwood first thinnings. That's because of those pulpwood markets. The value of the timber is not worth it for the logger to come out, and then the acreages that many of those landowners have don't justify the logger to come out. So the value of the timber as well as the acreages. So we're probably getting up now to like 60 acres, and you probably need 60 acres of saw logs to get a logger to come out. It is really bad in Mississippi. Parcelization and fragmentation, as I mentioned, they're going to continue to create smaller acreages as forest properties pass down to heirs. And it's going to create more and more smaller tracts and make it more and more difficult for these high investment, highly productive, but high investment timber companies to come out. So you're going to see, and we've already seen this, much more grouping or pairing of properties. This landowner's got 30 acres, this landowner's got 60, and this other landowner's got 40. The three of them separately couldn't get a logger to come out, but maybe together, it's on 130 acres, I believe. Maybe all together, the three of them could get a logger to come out. But each individual landowner or a landowner may have to have less than optimal forest management, almost kind of like the integrated timber companies years ago with the mill and the forest land, may have to have less than optimal, because they're just happy to get the logger out there, and they got to cut or harvest when they can get the logger out there. So we're going to see some issues with that going forward, as we already have. And the aging of our logging workforce is going to create problems, in my opinion, 10 or 15 years from now. We need more training to get younger generation interested in logging. Here's the median owner age, 1992 going down to 2022 from Conrad et al. You can see that the owners are getting older, and so is the workforce in general. This is from Alabama, and the disproportionate amount of 50 and up, the employees, and then the owners going forward in 20 years. What are we going to have? So we need to have some thought about that. Once again, the policy incentivizing people to get into this industry. Road infrastructure, poor county and parish roads, another issue in Louisiana and Mississippi. Bridges being out, that's hard on trucking particularly, but really limits certain landowners from harvesting, because if the bridge was not out, maybe the distance is feasible. The cost involved, they could haul to the mill, but with the bridge out, it adds another 20 miles, and therefore it no longer makes it feasible for the logger to come out, or greatly reduce stumpage value. So those bridges being out is a big issue. Inflation, insurance, and diesel prices are creating serious issues for loggers, particularly on the log trucking. And I think that drove out a fair amount of businesses recently. Here's just an example of policy. Phasing out the advantageous depreciation tax incentives like the bonus depreciation on this highly costly equipment. So that's a policy issue coming from the IRS, let's say, or the states, that could help incentivize investment into logging. Well, let's switch over now to log trucks, which is still logging operations, but inflation in insurance. For some, especially like new log truck drivers, $20,000 a year in insurance, $10,000 to $20,000. But like for the newer folks, $20,000 and probably up annual is really making it difficult for our new truck drivers to come in and to want to drive. So once again, you got to have policy. Diesel prices are another one, creating serious issues. This is increases in diesel as you go up, and what's that doing to the net revenue as higher diesel prices here? What's that doing to the revenue of these log truck drivers? The trucks themselves, the tractor trailers, the tractors, the trucks, the cabs are much more expensive, probably $175,000 and up for day cabs, not sleepers. And so you're probably going to see more and more trucks and trailers that are older trucks and trailers, because that's what those log truck drivers can afford, particularly your owner operator independent contractors. So this is James Shannon. He gave a talk at the Society of American Foresters in Mississippi. So this is Mississippi, and you can see an amount of trucks and the trailers on this logging equipment that are older. So do you want to be driving near 20-year-old trucks that have 88,000 pounds gross vehicle weights with, 60,000 pounds of payload of logs on there? How safe is that? So we got to, once again, policy going forward. Here's just the average yearly per truck insurance premiums on average, I believe, from 2021. So for newer drivers, as I said, they can go up into like $20,000, if not more, for new log truck drivers, really making it difficult. So we may see more of a dedicated log trucking, like for J.B. Hunt, big over-the-road, or Stevens Transport, or Mesilla Valley, large over-the-road companies that have nothing to do with logging or log trucking, getting into dedicated, where they buy the trucks and the trailers and they contract out to the loggers. So there's no more independent owner-operator log truck drivers, or the logging companies themselves do not employ log truck drivers, but they're going to contract out with these larger businesses, the economy of scale, that they can afford this trucking, because that's all that they're doing. And that's all that the logger's paying them for. So there's benefits to that. But then again, what's that going to do to the rural economies, to the local jobs for those rural economies? Sleeper cabs. I think these log truck drivers are spending much more time working. So these are good tools, right? But then these trucks, new and even used trucks, they cost more than the day cab. So here you can see he just has a day cab. Beyond that, these sleeper cabs weigh more. So you have these gross vehicle weights. Mississippi, it just went up actually from 84,000 pounds to 88,000 pounds. So you have the weight of the truck, the cab, the weight of the trailer, and then the difference is the payload, the amount of wood going from the harvested site to the mill. So the heavier the truck is, the heavier the trailer, the lower the payload, and the less money that log truck driver is making on that particular haul. So these are issues going forward that you have to be careful of, the utility of the sleeper, but then also maybe the cost of the truck themselves, plus the reduction maybe in the pay, in the revenue generated per haul, because you have this extra weight going to the truck. Then maybe we're going to get triple axles, increase these gross vehicle weights even more. So like in the lake states, they have triple axles. They can carry 90,000 and I think 98,000 pounds in the winter on those triple axles. Better distribute the weight. More aerodynamic trucks, more of these anteaters, and going away from the long nose. I like the long nose set forwards, but more of these anteaters set back. Cabs, more aerodynamic. A lot of discussion about interstates. So most of the federal interstates have gross vehicle weight restrictions of 80,000 pounds. But as I just showed you here, many of the states have on federal highways, not the interstates, federal highways, 4-lane, 2-lane highways, and in most state highways, right, this is going to apply. So you have higher GVWs, and that generally could assume it's going to be higher revenue per haul. But on the interstates, a lot of times when they're loaded, they won't go on the interstate because they'll be above and they'll be fine. But when unloaded, they'll come back on the interstate. But the issue is when loaded, how much traffic is going through these cities and towns, because these trucks can't use the interstates. So what's the issue there? Now, if you get more trucks on the interstates, what's that going to do to the number of accidents on the interstates? So there's these issues at play. And the harvest site weights, but particularly the mill weights, what can we do at the mills to reduce the mill weight to allow the more profitability to the log truck driver? The log truck driver is spending more time driving and less time sitting and waiting. What's that doing? Because you have these fixed costs on these vehicles. Lighter trailers I see, like, going down from 13,000 pounds to maybe 10,000 pounds on the four-bolster trailers, given the gross vehicle weight restrictions. So lighter trailers for the same cab weight means more payload per haul, and then more revenue per haul. And then truck driver shortages, and this is not just log trucks, but I mean the driver shortages that we're seeing as major issues. So let's switch a little bit to the mills and the markets. So a lot of times, as I said, we think of the forest industry, the timber industry, as these products, and that's certainly true, but there's a whole lot more to the forest industry. As I've already mentioned, kind of wildlife habitat, water quality now, multiple objective management, right? But nonetheless, let's talk about oriented strand board, lumber, veneer, plywood, poles, biomass, paper, particle board, and the residuals from lumber, plywood, and veneer, and maybe poles that are going to the biomass, going to the paper, going to the OSB, going to the particle board. So how all this plays out on the mill side. So beginning in the 50s and 60s in the South, at least, and into the 80s and 90s in earnest, much of the southern United States switched more to buying and selling timber on weight, tons, and going to tree length, not short wood. Much of the wood in the lake states and in central part of Canada is still stick scale, short wood on the truck, so loaded this way rather than long, such as here in the southeast that we see. There's advantages to both. There's 100-inch sticks in the lake states, but that allows you then to scale a lot on the ground. And so, as I said, as we're going forward with more and more absentee landowners, more and more smaller landowners, we're going to have to make sure that those foresters, those landowners are working with foresters, and that we're watching timber theft, because you're not stick scaling on the ground. Everything's being loaded onto the truck on those pay-as-cut timber sales, and everything's coming off. In my understanding, everything's coming off of the scales at the mill, and so that's going to be, that could be an issue, particularly with absentee landowners. I'm making sure that those landowners are working with good foresters, and that those foresters know the loggers that they're working with. I think the Pacific Northwest still works on NBF largely, and then you have differences in NBF, right? Doyle in the South, Scribner in the Pacific Northwest and Lake States, and then the international. Here's interesting. This is Missouri, or Timber Price Report International in the South and Doyle in the North. So tradition, that's still a player in much of our timber industry and those transactions, the wood supply chain. So let's talk a little bit about international policy. So the European Union deforestation law and concerns that the wood pellets, say for instance the bioenergy going to Europe, what's the source of the forest here? How are the forests managed here? And so is that going to tighten going forward? And that's going to be kind of interesting. And then, of course, unfortunately, the Russian-Ukraine war, hopefully that'll end soon for the sake of those people, but also the world, everybody. But what's the impacts of the Russian log exports to the European countries as well as China? And there has been from Canada and the western U.S. log exports, and how is that being impacted by the Russian-Ukrainian war and the Canadian-U.S. tariff. So my understanding is the U.S. believe that a lot of the wood, so we imported a lot of wood from Canada. Some of it's substitution, like white spruce has a particular look, but a lot of it was claimed by the U.S. to be subsidized by Canada. So if you know Canada, they have a lot of crown lands and everything's kind of based on a leased. Not a lot of forest land that's owned NIPF or friendly forest, my understanding, but a lot of crown land. So it's subsidized. So the U.S. imposed a trade tariff. That then combined maybe with wildfire issues in Canada, as well as the mountain pine beetle issues, has brought a lot of industry from Canada down southeast, and that's good for us. So there's these issues. There's many other issues going on, but there's some of these issues that are impacting us here in the southeast. Then you had issues like with Enviva and the biomass and the wood pellets. What are we going to have with Enviva and the EU going forward on the biomass pellet markets? So then we can talk about mills and markets and the correlation between stumpage values and lumber prices and housing starts. So the mortgage rates, right, 2022, 2021 going way up. What's that doing to the housing starts? And so you kind of see a little bit of a decline here, and it's supposed to come up a little bit. But right, lumber, the demand for lumber, and then we think a lot of times like saw logs leads into pulpwood. Unfortunately, that's no longer true, I think, in much of the western, southeastern U.S., particularly in Mississippi, where the pulpwood was kind of a come along, right, with the saw log, the more valuable saw log. Well, as I said, we may start switching our forest management regimes to a much more heavy sawlog. But the inflation rate as well playing a big thing on all the wood supply chain, landowner, logger, and mill. The lumber prices, hopefully, I think we've seen that stabilize a little bit, but the wood supply issues. Now, remember this. Remember I told you about those incentive programs from the 2000s and 80s. What I heard a lot of times is a lot of the loggers and landowners complaining that they never saw any of that. It didn't trickle down to them. Why? Here in the Southeast, probably because we had an overabundant supply. The recession as well may have created some issues with the supply where people didn't harvest. But we had an overabundant supply, so that this really didn't trickle down to the landowners or to the loggers, even though that massive jump up. So it does trend, but housing starts may not necessarily be as highly correlated, or lumber prices with sawlog stumpage values for a little bit of time until we get some of that supply down here in the Southeast. And then this poor stumpage prices. So here's kind of pine saw timber, south wide and flat, right? Relatively flat. Even though lumber prices were outrageous here, right? But stayed relatively flat. Here, Georgia, I think, responded a little bit, I believe, but Mississippi was flat. Once again, to me, Georgia has a lot more competition. And so you can see that growth to drain, the darker green, meaning a lot more growth to the amount harvested, growth to drain, compared to Georgia down here, these parts. So therefore, that to me kind of explains a little bit of that flatness in Mississippi, but a little bit of that jump in Georgia. Here's the pulpwood price change from 2009 to 2019. I think once again, that number of mills and the demand, the competition for stumpage compared to much of the western Gulf or the western half of the southeastern U.S. Mississippi is bad, so you can't really get a first thinning, pulpwood dominated first thinning. So those issues going forward are pretty big issues. And to me, as I said, we may switch more to a lower planting density, like 450, 400, 500, much more of a sawlog dominated management regime, get away from the two thinning regimes and may not even thin. Much like the Pacific Northwest has been doing for years, planting 400 to 500 and just going straight for the sawlog harvest. So remember though, the cost involved in logging out there as well is kind of high compared to here because of the mountainous regions. So just real quick, here's white oak and how this market has changed. This is an example of how things come and go. So white oak is rivaling off there almost walnut and black cherry. Very interesting. These are actually logs in southwest Mississippi being trucked up to Kentucky for flooring. That's just telling you the value of that white oak stumpage, and that's a market that's relatively, the market's not new, but the taken off that it has is relatively new. The movement of Canadian mills, so these are Canadian-owned companies down here to the south, once again, the mountain pine beetle, the wildfire, and the importance of this for the Southeast and how that's good for us, hopefully going to eat up some of that overabundant supply and get us back into better sawlog stumpages markets, and the trade tariff going in that's maybe brought some of the Canadian investment down south. The bigger importance of U.S. South lumber, pine especially, into the amount of lumber being produced and how Canada may kind of decrease going through time, particularly as we keep going through time. Mass timbers, right? CLT and glulam, laminated LVL, and much more mass timbers going forward. So this may become a much bigger player, and the importance of that for the lumber demand ultimately, because much of this is coming from lumber, almost like an OSB plywood, engineered wood, but now you're using, instead of strands like Orion strand board, now you're using pieces of lumber to build these bigger pieces of wood. Forest carbon markets and the going away of natural capital exchange, NCX, and these longer contract periods. The demand by society, once again, the societal demands. CCX went away, so you don't have maybe those upfront costs like you did with CCX, but still now the public and the buyers probably demand a more permanence. And so you're seeing this issue with 40 and 100-year contracts, creating issues for many forests here in the Southeast, maybe not so much for the lake states in the West, but creating issues here in the Southeast. Other trends, industry is going to pay much more attention to their carbon footprints going forward, the political, once again, the societal demands. New sawing approaches, same amount of stumpage may produce more lumber, which then may, once again, create problems for the stumpage values because you're utilizing, right, a lot more lumber recovery out of the same amount of stumpage. So it's good that we have better utilization rates, like curve sawing these optimization and cant scanners, but that may once again kind of hurt the landowner ultimately. And the paper production and the internet over the last 30 years and the roundwood demand, how that's impacted the roundwood pulpwood demand. And from what I hear, we're not going to have any new roundwood pulp mills going forward. Everything is going to be probably recycled paper mills. But think of those sawmill residuals as well. You're competing with the pulpwood roundwood demand, and may further decrease the prices. And once again, switching over to a lower planting density, much more of a saw log regime that we may see going forward. Here's just an example from Henderson, Kentucky. A new paper mill, but it's 100% recycled materials. So, and then here's an International Paper, their sustainability report from their carbon footprint. Thank you.